Thank you. That's a very, very generous introduction. I love Campion. Campion is just going great guns at the moment. And actually, I work very closely with Bree McKee, who I think topped the year. Do you? Yeah, she's an all-round star. Convinced her to leave Sydney, and she now lives in Melbourne. She hated it for the first 6 months, but she's adjusted to it now. But I'm going to talk today about the decolonization movement, which Christopher Dawson would be able to recognize as humanism gone wrong. And this dreadful ideology that is running rampant in our society. And I thought I'd start with an example of what happened about a month ago on the King's birthday in Melbourne. So a group of balaclava-clad, and I call them delinquents because I really do think they are, decided to have a go at the present king, Charles III, by venturing out in the middle of the night and decapitating a statue of George V. I mean, it's totally illogical, but this is how they operate. So they sawed his head off, it toppled to the ground, and then they took out their spray cans and graffitied the plinth with the words, "The colony will fall." This is 2024. They filmed the whole escapade, and they set it to the soundtrack of God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols. And then they wrote these crazy messages all over the plinth, happy birthday, mofo, hashtag the colony will fall, hashtag land back, hashtag free Palestine from the river to the sea, hashtag always was, always will be. So they love mixing their metaphors or mixing their hashtags. I found this, it's not amusing, but there are two very amusing aspects to it. First is that the current king is a fully signed up member of the climate change cult, so they'd have a lot more in common with him than they thought. His views on colonialism are very suspect as well. He actually argued that the history of the transatlantic slave trade should be given the same level of importance as the Holocaust. So, they have a lot more in common with Charles III than we do in this room, probably. And the second aspect is that they set this whole escapade to a song by John Lydon, aka Johnny Rotten, who's not only a MAGA supporter, but he called Trump the political sex pistol. And as it turns out, he doesn't hate the Queen at all. He actually wanted God to save the Queen. He's really conservative. And when they asked him about anarchy, he said, "Anarchy is a terrible idea. Let's get that clear. I'm not an anarchist." So this is just typical of the sort of illogical ignorance, there's no understanding of history, no checking of facts that motivates this movement. Here in Hobart, the statue of William Crowther was pulled down with a rope recently. And I think they beat the council by a day. I think the council was going to do it the next day anyway. And last week, there were a few activists tried to saw the statue of Captain Cook off at his ankles in Hyde Park. Fortunately, they obviously didn't buy the right size angle grinder because they couldn't get through the bronze. And of course, last weekend we saw the desecration of the war memorials in Canberra, which was just appalling. But facts don't matter to this mob. These statues, it doesn't matter who it is. It's the fact that they represent Western civilization, that they're symbols of Western civilization. And they've been taught that these symbols and Western civilization is racist and evil. It's a horrible movement that chooses emotion over superstition, and it chooses these things over reason and common sense, and it's barbarism over civilization. And they whip themselves up into this sort of frenzied state of blind fury, sort of punishing stone and metal, as if those inanimate objects actually have feelings. It's very pagan, really, isn't it? They're sort of endowing these things with life. It's also an expression of moral revulsion at the supposed racism and the ideas of cultural superiority. It's a self-righteousness that Christopher Dawson talked about. And it's a form of pride. So I had a look at the amount of statues that were pulled down during the BLM riots in America, and I was actually quite shocked. I thought that there were a few, but I had no idea that pretty much every Confederate statue and monument's gone in America. I had no idea. I can't imagine what it looks like. But of course the mob didn't stop at Confederate statues. They just pulled down any statue. Christopher Columbus, abolitionists, a newspaper man, a football player, and owner of the NFL. They pulled down a statue of an elk, and they even pulled down a statue of a black slave. So this is indicative of what we're seeing at the moment, which is a cultural revolution. It's a cultural revolution to remove the very symbols that embody Western civilization. And it's being done by a minority, but they're a very powerful minority. And they've been taught to see the past as something to be loathed. It's a political program, and it is a political program called decolonization, and it's a practical application of post-colonial theory. And post-colonial theory looks to deconstruct the West by systematically undoing colonialism and all its manifestations and impacts. Decolonization maintains that the West has constructed the idea that rationality and science are good, so that it then can perpetuate its own power and marginalize non-rational, non-scientific forms of knowledge production elsewhere. So it looks to devalue white Western ways of knowing, simply because it belongs to white Westerners. And it seeks to promote other knowledge instead. So in Australia, we have this constant promotion of Aboriginal knowledges over anything else. Not only that Aboriginal knowledge is equal to, but superior to Western knowledge. Decolonization also makes the claim that the rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, representative democracy, so-called heteronormativity, the traditional notion of the family, education, museums, libraries, time, are toxic institutions which have been specifically designed to oppress minorities and at the same time benefit white people, which is obviously totally irrational. And because the modern state of Australia is a product of Western civilization, this too can only be defined by oppression and racism and has to be destroyed. The idea that an entire nation can be irredeemably racist is actually an American idea, and it was embodied in the 1619 Project, which was launched in 2019 by the New York Times magazine. This narrative said that the United States was founded wholly on slavery and about perpetuating racial inequality. And this is the idea that we've imported into Australia. So in the US, they have to atone for the original sin of slavery. In Australia, we have to atone for the sin of colonization. And this is the idea that is propagated and taught through our education system. And our education system is basically producing the type of person who will put a balaclava on, hire an ankle grinder, go out in the middle of the night and try and cut a statue down at its ankles. It starts in kindergarten. I did a piece of work recently on the fact that the government-mandated early learning framework is basically saying to toddlers that they need to be put on the road to reconciliation. They need to be active citizens. They need to be political. They need to get out there in their nappies and write their reconciliation action plans instead of messing around in the sandpit, because this is the time it starts. They're also very, very, very enthusiastic to start talking to them about gender and sex. Apparently, this is the most exciting time that you can talk to children about these things when they're still in nappies. That's another talk altogether. But really, what's happening is that they're being introduced very early on to the idea that Australia is fractured, and it's fractured in a way that is fractured along racial lines. So the educators are told in this document that they have to recognize, quote, that diversity contributes to the richness of our society and provides a valid evidence base about ways of knowing, but also that Australian children have to have a greater understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of knowing and being actively working towards reconciliation. Remember, this is a document that's been written for 0 to 5-year-olds. This is they can't even read or write yet. This is just overt politicization and activism in early learning centres. The other thing that educators are told to do in early childcare is decolonize their spaces and focus on colonization. I don't know how you do that. I think that's pretty much just putting up Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags, taking down the Australian flag. I had a look at some of the early learning centres. Just you can look at them. You can do sort of virtual tours on the internet, and the classrooms are just covered in these flags and sorry signs and Aboriginal handprints. And they're all doing the acknowledgement to countries in the morning. They all know it off by heart. They can recite it in whatever Aboriginal language the early learning centre chooses, but they can't read or write and barely speak English. But this is what's going on in the early learning centres. And of course then they go to school and it doesn't get any better, it gets worse. Through the national curriculum, we have the Torres Strait Islander and Indigenous Aboriginal priorities that mean that everything in this curriculum is just focused on the evils of decolonisation and just really, really making sure that this child knows that they're on stolen land, that that they've got to feel guilty about something that people they weren't related to did 250 years ago. So even people, children of recent migrants are told that they need to feel guilty about something that happened 250 years ago. And they could be from Vietnam or from anywhere in the world. And of course, it's no surprise that we're getting all these reports now that the welcome to countries and the acknowledgement of countries in school are getting way out of control. They're becoming really elaborate and very performative, and it came to light that in a Sydney primary school the other day, the parent got quite upset because they found out that the child was having to put their hands on the ground and repeat, always was, always will be Aboriginal land before every assembly. I mean, this is happening in schools all over the country. In Victoria, they do this sort of the Aboriginal national anthem, which is apparently just to a didgeridoo and Aboriginal instruments instead of Western instruments. Universities, obviously, this is where it all comes from. Academics in history departments have long since lost any interest in history. History is just you can't learn anything from history. It's all postmodernist. It's a complete waste of time. You've got to look at gender, you've got to look at race. Class, not so much. It's a bit old-fashioned, a bit Marxist. But really, this narrative about Australia has been concocted in the history departments. Historians have reinvented themselves as social justice warriors. They have a clearly defined program to critique Western civilization and Australia. You may remember that it was 8 years ago the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization tried to run courses on great books in universities, and they got shouted down for being white supremacists, and if you read Shakespeare you're going to go out and commit some kind of crime afterwards and because you'll be a white supremacist. I mean, they really seriously think along these lines. I think it's a virus, it's a mind virus, that once you adopt this view of Western civilization in Australia, there's no going back, especially if your career depends on it. You have to pursue this diabolical destruction of the country from your academic, from your desk, basically. A few years ago, I did a look. I looked at the teaching of history in this country. I think I did the report in 2 years ago. Looked at 791 subjects that are taught across the universities here. They all covered race and identity and sexuality. So I think that's right. 54 subjects looked at sexuality, and only 17 looked at the Reformation, because the Reformation is not very interesting really when it comes to history. They've been basically schooled in Marxist political and postmodernist theory. So the historians have taken on this idea, this notion from Frantz Fanon, who claimed that colonialism is a machine of naked violence, and they've taken to heart his admonition that imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove from our land, but from our minds as well. And what matters is not to know the world, but to change it. So this is what they're teaching universities students at the moment. They're really training them in how to decolonize. There's a ANU's Australian National University subject called Decolonizing Methodologies and Other Indigenous Perspectives on Research. And this teaches students to critically challenge problematic truths because obviously truths are relative, and other powerful ideas that have contributed to the dispossession and marginalization of First Nations people. In Victoria at La Trobe University, they can do Colonizing Australia's First Peoples, which encourages students to examine the relationship between the discipline of history and colonialism, including the problems created when knowledge is constructed using the colonial archive. And what we're having, obviously, is people going through these courses, graduating, finding jobs very easily, because there is actually quite a call for decolonizers in our institutions. And they're getting jobs and they're decolonizing our institutions because our institutions seem to be in a race to see who can decolonize the fastest. I went to the Art Gallery of New South Wales recently, and I was so appalled that I wrote a specky article about it, but they've basically taken down all the labels, anything that you'd want to know about the painting, you know, the materials, the artist, well, they tell you the artist, but you know, what the artist was thinking at the time, what he was trying to achieve, the techniques used, you know, where the painting might have first been hung. They don't tell you that, they've taken that down. They've basically written mini political manifestos on every painting, and I was just enraged by the end of my visit, because I'd gone next door to look at the modern one, just to see if there was anyone in there, and there wasn't, just as I thought there wouldn't be. So I thought, well, at least I can then sort of go next door and see some of the 18th century stuff, the 19th century stuff, and this visit wasn't a waste of time. And then the more I looked, the closer I read, the more I realized how terrible it was. So there's a beautiful 1848 Conrad Martins. It's a view of Sydney Cove. It looks like it should be a scene of poetic tranquility, but it's not. It's a depiction of invasion and dispossession. So the label says, Martins symbolically reinforces colonial law and prosperity. The newly built government house emerges as a luminous beacon, visually encoding Gadigal lands and waters as gleaming subjects of British rule. I don't want this. Every time I go to a gallery, I don't want to be lectured. And this is what's happening. Everything's being decolonized. Even food. There's a restaurant in Melbourne, in Federation Square, which prides itself on adhering to this idea of food justice or post-colonial food politics. All their food has been decolonized, so you can be safe. If you're a lefty, you can go to this restaurant, you won't feel guilty. It'll be sustainable as well. In fact, some of the food I remember was sourced by a queer group, not by, but you can't have the food being sourced by heteronormative, very boring white cisgender males. They have to be queers in order to go to this restaurant. It's quite insane. I mean, it's a Foucauldian idea of food justice. And they think they need to deconstruct food in order to put an end to social inequality, discrimination, racism, and sexism. And they basically say agriculture is patriarchal, white supremacist, and heteronormative. So, you know, we can't farm anymore because that's racist. But they actually take this stuff seriously. It's ludicrous. We can see it's ludicrous, but the people doing it can't. This is the problem. And we can see it's ludicrous because now they're saying everything's racist. You know, the countryside is racist. Apparently the recent eclipse in the US was racist as well. They managed to actually justify these things. It's incredible. Timekeeping is racist. Buildings are racist. And according to the latest, I don't know if anyone saw it, but there was an episode going around in America. There's a drama set in a hospital. And there's a scene between the doctor and the sister of the patient. And he says, I'm sorry, but you know, so-and-so has cancer. And she's like, how did they get cancer? And they just went, racism. And this is serious. That someone's writing this and the actors are acting. Nobody thinks it's funny. But you know, but people who still have their sense intact and have a grip on reality can see that this is ridiculous. But unfortunately, it means that, you know, it's as I said, we're being subjected to it on a daily basis. And it's kind of ruining life. I wanted to go to the gallery and look at some paintings, and I wasn't. I was shouted at about how I should feel guilty that these paintings even exist. The decolonizers think that our enjoyment is not only irrelevant, but it's morally wrong. We shouldn't be enjoying these things. We shouldn't be enjoying the fruits of Western civilization. We have to be beaten over the head everywhere we go with this political cudgel. We have to be guilty about the fact that the first fleet arrived here in 1788. We have to be guilty about the success of the colony. And we have to be guilty about enjoying the rich fruits of Western civilization. Every time we sit through a Qantas flight and we land, and we have to be welcome to our own country. Every time we're lectured on the Sky Bus, I don't know if anyone here has had the misfortune of catching the Sky Bus in Melbourne, but they crank up the volume and they shout at you about how sovereignty was never ceded, and then they go, "Welcome to Melbourne." So which it's completely schizophrenic. Do you want me to be here or not? I'm just, we're being alienated in our own country by this pernicious movement, which is just eating away at our institutions. And I think it's sort of it's demoralization by decolonization. We're being demoralized. It has a profound impact on society. But it all goes down to the fact that we're being taught a very twisted version and a wrong version of Australian history. And society is being fed a wrong historical narrative, and that's really important because historical narratives are really important and highly potent in shaping national self-understanding and self-worth. And this means that the historical narrative has profound historical significance. So we're being told constantly that the modern state of Australia is not just a terrible mistake, but it's a crime that we have to endlessly apologise for. So our national calendar, I was looking at it the other day, we have basically 12 months of continuous apology. It starts with a national apology to the Stolen Generation Day in February, then we have National Close the Gap Day in March, then we have National Sorry Day and Reconciliation in May and then in June, and then for the rest of the year it's a sort of mea culpa sort of heartbeat, just this sorry, but of course it's an apology that is never ending, because there's never a point where they say, all right, okay, let's just move on. Apology accepted. Let's just move on as a unified country. Instead, every year the voices get louder to call for Australia Day to be cancelled, and of course called Invasion Day. And a lot of Australians are becoming more reluctant to fly the Australian flag or express any sadness, any pride in country. The country, not country. And we even have our politicians are part of the problem. Penny Wong, as foreign minister, I don't know if any of you remember, but she flew to England last year and she started lecturing the Brits about how bad the empire was and the horrors of colonialism. This is Penny Wong. And then Albo stands up and says, children aren't learning the right history, but children need to learn the truth about Australia's history. What he means is that children need to learn more about the racism and the dispossession, the decolonisation. I mean, you can't cram any more of this in the national curriculum than there is already, so he obviously hasn't read it. But they're part of the problem. The voice to Parliament was part of this idea, was just decolonisation. It was trying to divide Australia by race, trying to create a parallel system of representative government that just comprised Aboriginal Australians to the exclusion of all other Australians. And during this referendum, the relationship between citizens completely broke down. I don't know what it was like in Tasmania, but I live in Paddington in Sydney. You can imagine what that was like. We were the only no voters in the street. We were the only ones that didn't have a sign in our house. I was called a racist on polling day, which was actually quite handy because I filmed it and didn't have to spend 8 hours for the rest of the day handing out no cards in Darlinghurst, which I was dreading actually. But how did we get to this where suddenly we were pitted against each other? It was like a civil war. It was like families being divided against families, children not talking to parents. This dreadful breaking down of society. But on the upside, it actually focused people's minds and it made people think about what it is to be Australian, and it made people think about our history. It actually woke people up from a slumber, I think, like just as COVID did. And so while we were divided at the time, I think it actually forced people to reconsider what this country is and value what they were trying to take away from us, which is why, in the end, so many people voted against it, so people realized what the problem was. But of course, they're pushing ahead anyway in Victoria with the very Orwellian Truth and Justice Commission, which again is based on historical falsehood that Australia is racist to its core. They are the ultimate aim of this commission, I think, is reparations and payment to the people who will claim that their land has been stolen. Thomas Mayo, I saw, hasn't given up. He's about to release another book, and it's called Always Was, Always Will Be. And he went on 2GB and said we won't give up. And so they don't give up, and this is the problem. They're driven. The rest of us try and get on with our lives, and this is the problem with preserving what we already have. It's harder to preserve what we already have than it is for activists to pull it down, because it's easier to be driven by, I think, by this spirit of hatred and destruction than it is the spirit of conserving and trying to lead a quiet, normal life. The problem is that we've lost our connection with history, and historians have let us down. And I joke about the historians in the faculties saying that they're not interested in history anymore, but this comes at quite a cost. There was a great English philosopher historian, R.G. Collingwood, and he wrote, "History is for human self-knowledge. The only clue to what man can do is what man has done. The value of history, then, is that it teaches us what man has done, and thus what man is." We're not getting that at all. He wouldn't recognize anything that's going on at the moment in history departments. And of course, one of the fundamental problems with this postmodernist idea is that it means you can learn nothing from the past. And it says historians should give up any special claim to authority. And this is why we have the mobs rampaging through our cities, pulling the statues down. It seems like not a very, it's a serious thing, but really what underlines it is that it is a destruction of our past, and it means that we won't have any record of anyone who, we won't know who Wytham Crowther was, people won't know who Captain Cook was, people won't know anything about the past, and they won't know how to then conduct themselves in the future. So we need to start rewriting history. We need to start, I think the pendulum swung quite far. I think the fact that people pushed back this year when Woolworths decided not to stock the Australia Day stuff. And Dutton, credit to him, actually, when he boycotted Woolworths, it actually got a lot of traction. People are starting to say enough is enough. And especially something like the desecration of the monuments doesn't do this side any favours at all, because it really is apolitical. So I think we have Campion. We have an amazing set of graduates coming out. Campion has been 20 years in the making, 25 years. And now I tell you what, the grounding that they're getting is just incredible. We need Campion students to go out into society and start rewriting the narrative from the institutions that they find themselves in. We have to start pushing back against this and not being scared of the mob. And I think we need to look at Europe, and we need to look to see that the fact that Europeans have woken up and they've realised what's been going on. Because in England they've obviously been told, well, England's actually going the wrong way, but Europe's going the right way. And I think we need to look at just being bold again and standing up to this false narrative. And I think we can take great comfort from the Voice referendum and the fact that most mainstream Australians are on our side and still very proud of Australia. So that's all I have to say on that. I hope it made sense, but it's a very hard thing to summarize because it's such a crazy notion, and there's so much rot that underpins it, and I didn't have that much time. So I hope it was entertaining and instructive. But thank you very much.